Welcome back to the Fire Break. I'm Steve Wolf, and as you know, the Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, where we're working to build technologies to eliminate wildland fire related deaths and reduce wildfire property loss. A noble cause, a big goal, but if you don't set big goals, don't expect to accomplish much. I've got Molly Mowery here, and Molly is the executive director of Community Wildfire Planning Center, and she's the president and owner of Wildfire Planning International, a very, very in demand woman in this wildfire space. I reached out to her uh, about 18 months ago, and she finally found 30 minutes for us. So I really appreciate you joining us. How are you today, Molly?
Good. Thank you, Steve. I apologize. I did not realize it has been that long since you were asking me to join your podcast.
Hey, you
Uh,
got you got important things to do, like help communities not burn down.
yes,
So I appreciate you've got your priorities in the right place as
yeah,
far as I'm concerned. So tell me what you do and and the whole idea behind the community preparedness.
sure. So, as you just alluded to, we are pretty busy. In 2017, I co founded a nonprofit organization called the Community Wildfire Planning Center with my colleague Kelly Johnston. So, together we run that organization. And then, as you also mentioned, I have had for 11 years now a small consulting practice as well, where I provide and have provided technical assistance to communities, all to do with land use planning primarily. How do we help um, state, local government agencies and other community stakeholders make better decisions about the wildland to urban interface, where we plan, what we plan, how we develop, where we grow our communities, or how we retrofit existing communities. So it is it's challenging, it's exciting, it's demanding. As you were saying, I haven't been able to schedule you for a year and a half. I think sometimes I have one big guilt trip about how many people I sometimes can't respond to in a timely basis, just because right now, everyone is interested in wildfire. So it's a good thing,
Well,
but it's
that's not going to go away. I have a feeling it's only going to get worse. So,
yeah,
you know, have no guilt. You're doing all you can,
yeah.
and you can't work with everybody. But
Hmm.
I don't know. Maybe you can magnify your effort with more people. I don't know.
Well,
More something. What can you do?
that is one thing we've pivoted to. Well, partially we had this opportunity, but one of our big areas of focus right now is doing trainings. We are working with CAL FIRE. We received a grant a few years ago through CAL FIRE, and so we developed and co-launched with CAL FIRE a series of trainings across the state last year, and we're doing them again this year, bringing together land use planners, fire marshals, pre fire engineers, fire chiefs, building officials, all planning and fire related folks that we can get in the same room together. We tell them about state minimum requirements. What do you have to know? But we also talk about best practices for planning in the WUI. So I think in some ways that really warms my heart because we get to have a wider reach. You do see some more immediate impacts from the trainings. It's nice to when people come up to you afterwards and say, "Thank you so much. This was very helpful." And you can see some of the wheels turning in people's minds about what they're learning and how they're connecting some of these concepts for themselves.
Very interesting. So I spoke with a gentleman last week, and when you talked about land use planning, he had a very interesting take on that. He referred to it as arranging the fuels. Right? So his presumption was at some point there will be a fire everywhere. And the question is, where are the fuels and what are they? Right? How far apart are the houses? Do we penetrate up into areas where we're overdue for a fire, but we let a developer build there anyway? What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's always interesting to hear different perspectives on land use planning. It's actually one of the things we ask in our trainings is what is land use planning? And I think of it a bit more broadly, not just through a fire lens of where we bring intentionality to how we grow our communities, how we direct specific land uses, what are allowed, what's not allowed. It's really not just fuels. You could think about other land uses that aren't so much fuel specific in terms of houses or vegetation. So you might think of other types of open space areas. I mean, those do have fuels, but recreational centers, activity centers. We also talk about with land use planning, where we want to have density, where we want to prioritize growth in certain areas, where we may have land uses that are commercial oriented versus residential, mixed use. So it goes a little bit beyond just where, like the arrangement of the fuels, but a lot focuses on the type of uses as well, which in some cases could definitely translate into the type of fuels, but I think I would look at it a little bit more broadly than just through the fire lens. It's also,
Well, yeah.
you can think about how efficiently you move people through certain areas. Where do we develop more corridors for transportation and circulation patterns and topics like that?
Right. A firefighter told me the worst thing you could do is be 10,000 meters or more from the major artery because we're probably not coming for you. And that it wasn't how well you hardened your home, but how accessible it was to firefighters in terms of their ability to have confidence that they could safely get in and out if they needed to. So,
Yeah, that's actually a big hot topic for the land use planning fire world is the density discussion. So should we build low density? Should we have prioritized low density in high hazard areas? Should there be higher density in other areas? And the answer is always it depends. I think that's the answer for almost every fire topic that we have, but it depends on a lot of factors. In fact, it's fresh on my mind because we were just on a call before this with a community we're working with in Colorado. And, we talked about, well, if you do have low density, exactly to your point, how spread out, for lack of a better word, are houses. And what does that mean? Sometimes with larger lots, you get larger structures. You also get other structures and other uses, like you may have barns, stables, agricultural type and grazing, which means you have animals, which means during an evacuation, you have other considerations. So I don't like to look at low density as kind of an easy fix for just saying, oh, well, we can meet our setback defensible space requirements if we have low density, problem solved. It raises other considerations that have to be thought about in the planning process.
well, first of all, I'm happy that you called them animals. Uh, I'm reviewing, of course, daily the news out of the Texas Panhandle,
Mm-hmm.
where those lost things are referred to as assets, livestock, head of cattle, and there seems to be a complete ignoring of the fact that these are animals and that they deserve some care and consideration. Um, so, because of your schedule, very tight, very in demand, and just proximity that not everyone can get to you in California or here in Colorado, um, for people listening out in what we used to call Radio Land, but now I'll just call the rest of the planet. What would be some of the top takeaways in terms of best practices that you would recommend to a community if they don't have access to a Molly Mowery, but they do want to have a meeting in their community and start to discuss, wildfire resilience, better planning? What would be some of the top things you would impart?
Yeah, this is geared a little bit more to specific audiences. So, the advice I'm about to give, it's very simple. It's having a meeting between fire department and planning department. It's great when it can be around a specific set of plans. So there's something to speak to. Those plans would generally be what's in our comprehensive, or sometimes called the master or general plan. How old or current are our policies related to safety and land use and hazards? So looking at that plan alongside two other plans, whether or not there's a community wildfire protection plan in place, if there is, great. What does it say, if anything, about land uses? And then also bringing in the local hazard mitigation plan. Sometimes jurisdictions have it called or have adopted a multi-jurisdictional hazard mitigation plan. So those are really our key plans that we like to bring together, and we like to bring fire departments, fire marshals, fire chiefs, fire mitigation specialists, anyone associated in some capacity with WUI planning, as well as the planning department. And again, typically that would be more on the long range planning side. So the planners making decisions that have to do with longer term growth and development, mostly associated with a comprehensive plan. That's not to exclude anyone else, but those would be kind of the core group we would focus on. And so if you are in your community and one, you're not familiar if you have those plans, that's a good starting point to see if you have them, to see what the age is, how current and relevant are these plans and policies or actions still in terms of guiding our decisions about wildfire and land use, and how connected are they? Oftentimes, Steve, I've probably reviewed thousands of plans across the country, and it's easy to see the ones that have been very thoughtful, and there's others that and it's not just what the date is. Sometimes a CWPP could still be relevant even if it's 10 years old, but if a lot of conditions on the ground have changed and it hasn't been updated in a while, it's really not that useful anymore. So getting those plans in one place and facilitating a dialogue with what are we doing? Where do we want to grow? What's the time frame for these plans and their updates? Who's in charge of implementing the CWPP? Major best practice is to have the planning department represented on those hazard committees, wildfire hazard, the CWPP committee, and have regular meetings. So again, very simple, but it's surprising how often this doesn't happen. We all sometimes get in silos for various reasons, or I always encourage the planners, being a planner myself, there are no dumb fire questions. Fires professionals tend to use a lot of acronyms, and don't be shy in terms of asking, what does this mean? What Just because it says fire hazard doesn't mean a planner can't engage in the topic.
So when we talk about looking through different lenses, like my near glasses for the computer and my far glasses for driving and whatnot, they look the same, by the way, and I mix them up all the time. But when we talk about the fire departments meeting with the planning folks, do the fire departments, at least the old guard, really come from a perspective of the fire department is there to put out your house, not to put out your neighborhood? And to what degree have we been successful in creating a shift towards community fire planning versus individual home protection, salvation, suppression?
I think I've been fortunate, blessed, lucky, whatever word you want to use, in my career, because the fire departments and districts I've been able to work with across the country have all been not only receptive to land use planning, but very much in need and want of it. Oftentimes when we approach communities, the fire department says, they're bought into what can we do to help our community adopt a WUI code, strengthen the regulations for access and water supply, take more of an active role in this. And so I'm sure there's been some exceptions along the way, but by and large, we get really early buy-in because the fire professionals that we interface with really know what we can do and achieve through land use planning only supports their public safety, their response time, their ability to move people in and out more quickly, more safely respond to areas, and then sometimes, like getting back to your earlier point, reduce what's at risk in the first place. So again, I think I've been lucky, or I think we've just gotten to work with the right people anyway.
Well, yeah, people probably wouldn't call you if they're not looking for what you bring. So
Exactly.
there's some self-selection at work there.
Yeah.
Which communities do you feel like have been the most engaged in a way that has really helped to protect those communities? And what are the attributes of those communities, even if they couldn't be adopted by other communities? Like, who's really making progress in this space?
Sure. One that stands out a lot in my mind is Sonoma County. I profiled them for a few different case studies, and I think I have been continuously impressed with the level of engagement that Permit Sonoma, their planning department, brings, their emergency management brings, their different fire response and districts bring. Um, I think, though, the challenge is they've had a lot of very significant fires. And so it's maybe not, it's a challenge we see in general. Oftentimes people are coming together in communities to do fantastic collaborative work as a result of fires. And in my dream world, we would see communities taking a really proactive approach before the fires. I mean, that's every hazard mitigation professional's dream, right? So,
Right, right.
it's
After the fire, everyone gets very proactive.
right. How do you
Yeah.
prompt that action before the devastating fires? And I think some communities are learning, but it is hard to generate that level of enthusiasm and commitment sometimes without the urgency of we've just experienced this, especially when there's repeat fires. It's even more urgent.
Yeah. And, I kind of divide the world into places that are really justifiably concerned about wildfire and places that are going to be concerned about it. And
Hmm.
the question is like, how do you move the needle to get people from saying like, oh, we don't have to worry about this, we're not a wildfire prone area, to
Hmm.
like, hey, wait a minute, we see that in the next year, 5 years, 10 years, if things continue the way they are, we're going to be in a dangerous, wooey situation. What can
Hmm.
we do about it now? Uh,
It's really hard. Without naming names, there are several, probably actually more than several, many communities we've been to and worked with across the country where we'll work with them, or we have worked with them one season, and we say, we're trying to get your attention. There's a wildfire challenge here, which you'll likely encounter. And we aren't in any way dismissed, but I think that urgency isn't there. And then, sometimes it's the same year we've worked with them, they experience a significant fire. So it's hard to have what almost sometimes feels like psychic powers, but really it's just science and awareness that most of our areas are wildfire prone under the right conditions.
and with regard to the science, it seems like for every dollar spent on science, someone else is spending $10 to try to discredit the science, particularly with causation. Um, but I guess we're really not so focused on causation as on, what are we going to do going forward? So, to what degree do you feel like that impacts people's willingness to plan and to implement?
Well, one of the it's it's a catch-22. There's certainly more information available, which is great when we have public meetings and the public has someone from the public has taken the latest NIST report and said, this is how homes burn, and we know, we're kind of armed and equipped with this great information. On the flip side, though, we often have community members or certain industries represented that say, well, this is how much it's going to cost. And right or wrong, those cost estimates, pun intended, spread like wildfire. And if they're not accurate, or even if to some degree, let's say they are accurate, the cost discussion tends to override all other measures of safety, and the rationale sort of changes between this is a good investment over time to this is an immediate cost that we don't want to bear. And I know there's studies that say, some costs are relatively neutral or very minimal investment, but truly there are in some cases there will be a cost. But the question is, if we don't invest now, how much are we paying for later that's even more? Retrofitting a community is far more expensive than doing it the right way from the beginning. So, and we don't have a lot of data, unfortunately, to quantify exactly how much it would cost to retrofit. But, and anecdotally, when we've worked with communities talking about what it costs to underground some utilities, expand roadways, if it's even possible to expand a roadway, oftentimes vegetation clearance is the only way they can approach it, if they can't even do that. So it's a huge investment to retrofit, and it's often much more feasible on the front end. I feel like that was a little bit of a wandering response, but
It's a good answer.
yeah.
I think I think one of the issues is that the expense is coming from one bucket, and the true cost is coming from another one, right? That a community, or city planners, city budget people, like they're like, well, there's only so much we're going to spend on this. Of course, once there's a fire, it's open purse strings, and you spend whatever it takes to put the fire out, and that usually greatly exceeds what you would have spent
Mhm.
to do things right the first place. But it looks like the um, the municipalities are being asked to spend on the prevention side, and the insurance companies are the ones who have to spend when that failure to plan and mitigate happens. So the pain is borne by the insurance companies, and then I guess like trickle down through the people who pay the premiums. Um,
Well, and I am not an insurance guru by any means or an insurance expert, but I think there's a nuance to it, in that maybe the better question is who's bearing the cost of the mitigation as well, because the more places are mitigated, more investments happen for mitigation programs, let's say home hardening. The insurance company will be the beneficiary of that as well as the homeowner, but however that risk is reduced, if there's less exposure, then that will benefit who's ever the carrier of the coverage, right? So
right.
it's not that's not in any way finger pointing. It's just the reality of, we see a lot of fire departments who have limited budgets. Homeowner calls the fire department and says, I got a letter from my insurance. We need to be new X, Y, and Z. Can you either A, write us a letter, or B, come out and do an assessment? Well, that puts the onus on the fire department to go and provide that resource, right? When that mitigation occurs, homeowner hopefully gets to maintain their insurance, and the insurance provider gets their needs met because they said, okay, great, their risk is then reduced too. So big picture, we all want risk to be reduced. To your point, who and how it gets done may vary, and it's not necessarily a linear relationship. I don't think that should stop us from reducing risk in any way. I think we just need to be cognizant that, you know, communities, fire departments, they do need support for these programs.
So if I like I did, I got a letter from my insurance company, and it said, next year, by the way, your insurance is going to be 5 times what it was last year. Um, and so the fire departments aren't set up to go out to everyone's home and do an inspection. Or so is this an area where CWPPs, or wildfire aware programs, or community programs can provide an inspection, some mitigation, some landscape improvement, some retrofitting, and then provide those certifications, so we're not burdening with the fire departments with one more thing that they were never set up to do.
Yeah, absolutely. Two thoughts on that. One is, I think you live in Boulder County, right?
I do.
Not to put you on the spot publicly if you don't want
No, I
to
do.
say.
I do.
Okay.
I literally watched the Marshall Fire from my living
Okay.
room window. So
So
yes,
you're in an amazing place for fire mitigation, because there is the Wildfire Partners program, and we have helped a few other places across the state. So that's independent. Wildfire Partners is operated, administered by Boulder County, but we've worked closely with the blessing of Boulder County to develop a very similar program in Eagle County called Real Fire. And then we also support one in Jefferson, part of Jefferson County, in the Elk Creek and Intercanyon Fire Protection District. So and that really streamlines that process. So there is a system where homeowner has someone to call, a number to call. They can schedule an assessment. That's kind of the perfect world scenario for how to organize this. So it's not just an ad hoc, send me a letter, I need help, calling the fire department. So there are organized programs that homeowners may be fortunate enough to be living in an area where those are offered. The other side of the coin to that is it's ironically an argument for regulations because no, a lot of people don't have the resources to do all of this. And in a perfect world, everyone would do mitigation voluntarily. They clean their gutters, they would mow their lawns, they would maintain their defensible space, they'd retrofit out their combustible wooden fences. Great. But we know people don't voluntarily do that everywhere. And so that would be an argument to say, okay, well, let's create a baseline where we know, make it more predictable. Everyone's on this kind of baseline playing field of these are the rules of landscaping. These are the rules of attachments, decks, fences, etc. Rules meaning these are the standards by which we will write into our code what you have to follow. I know there are a lot of arguments against people wanting more regulations, but that is one of the reasons where regulations can be beneficial because it alleviates the need to rely only on voluntary efforts.
Yeah, especially because of the risk that individual homeowners are exposed to as a result of whatever practices their neighbor does or doesn't do. I
Yeah,
could
exactly.
mitigate the heck out of my property, and if my neighbor doesn't, then the ember cast from his house is eventually going to light my house on fire.
Yeah, and we've
So,
seen even some ordinances that address that. So Napa County, for example, is one of the case studies we use in our trainings that I mentioned, and I believe in their fire hazard abatement ordinance, they've addressed neighboring parcels where if you are creating or inhibiting your neighbor's ability to do the full despace, then you're responsible for maintaining that vegetation within proximity to their defensible space. So there are ways, again, I'm sensitive to thinking, regulations aren't the answer for everything, but I think sometimes they get kind of a bad rap for the wrong reasons, and
yeah,
they
no.
do serve a purpose.
Yeah, no, absolutely. You could almost think of it like sidewalks, right? If you want to live in an area where you get the convenience of a sidewalk, then you have the responsibility to shovel the snow on that sidewalk, or be responsible when someone slips on it. It's maybe a much simpler example.
Mhm.
What else would you tell people living elsewhere? People in Botswana, Bangladesh, Greece,
Oh gosh.
Portugal.
I
Like,
think that's a little out of my geographic scope.
yeah, I get it, but I'm guessing things like defensible space apply
Yeah.
everywhere, right?
I would imagine, I think what we're starting to see with these more extreme events is the importance of mass evacuation planning. This has been a topic for a number of years, but it's really coming into play more. And I think just having the awareness of we will be seeing and continue to see mass evacuation at scales that, you know, 15 years ago, I think it was the Colorado Springs Waldo Canyon fire when the headline was 30,000 people evacuated in what year that was, 2011, I think. Um, that was a huge deal. Now, when you see 30,000 people evacuated, you think, ah, okay. And I don't mean in any way to trivialize that. I think it's just for context. Now it's sometimes 100,000 people are evacuated. And I think as we see that as more of the norm, more communities will have to plan for that.
Yeah, and how do they do that? Because that's a lot of people on roads that were designed to have incremental
Mhm.
flow, not everyone on them at once. And so not only how many lanes do you need, how do you switch all the lanes to be going away from the fire? And
Yeah.
then how do you do evacuation route hardening so that once people are on those roads, burning trees aren't falling down and blocking their exit?
Yeah, and we were at a training a few weeks ago, and the at the EOC, and the sign in the back said, "Hope is not a strategy," and I think that encapsulated it so well. I mean, all everything about planning is, we know there's not necessarily a perfect plan that will work perfectly every time, but planning in general is so critical. And we always say to planners and elected officials and fire officials, but chances are they've already thought about it, is if you haven't thought about what you're going to do in this case, start thinking about it, because we have seen so many communities, not just with mass evacuations, but then say 500 homes, 1,000 homes are just gone almost literally overnight. If there's not a process in place to consider what does that look like, it can be so challenging. There's so many factors coming together during that short and long-term recovery, and completely overwhelming. So we always tell community planning departments, think about this, and work with your elected officials on what you're going to do in this kind of event.
Yeah, and there's, I guess, a different, mind psyche approach, because the fire department is generally populated with people who have that orientation towards action. You know, when the crap hits the fan, I'll figure it out and I'll know what to do.
Yeah.
Because I'm ready, I'm trained, I got the equipment, and that's not necessarily the mindset for people who say, like, let's plan this 6, 12, 5 years, in advance. So they're really different skill sets
Mhm.
that have to, I think, come from different sectors.
Yeah, and just even thinking about having a process in place. How are you going to review potentially several hundred permits that will come in at some point for rebuilding, right?
Right.
Many
Yeah.
planning departments are not equipped for that volume in a short amount of time. So thinking about those in advance, even if you don't have every detail laid out, just having a broad framework is helpful.
So not only, right, how would you scale up your
Mhm.
evacuation routes? How would you scale up your permit processing situation, right?
Yeah,
Or your,
exactly.
yeah, or how would you modify your land use plan going back? I drove around in the Marshall Fire area last week, uh, only to see homes going back exactly where they were, built out of the same materials they were built out of before, and it seemed like there were lessons lost,
Mm.
which you probably can't comment on. Those are probably some of your clients. Um, but to what degree do you see communities and community planners, like, really genuinely willing to learn from recent mistakes and do things differently, versus saying, well, we'll rebuild. What's the likelihood that there's going to be another fire like that?
Well, yeah, I can comment more globally on it. Sometimes, and it's not to let anyone off the hook, but sometimes there are challenges with changing, and this is the with the fire situations makes it very challenging, because rezoning is hard enough, but rezoning under a post-fire situation is very hard because there are a lot of emotions going on. So if you want to say, well, we're going to change the zoning, we're going to change the allowable setbacks and the building footprints, how big can I build? And that can be difficult, and sometimes the insurance provider will say, well, no, in order to get your insurance claim, you need to build back this way. And so sometimes there are tight parameters on how a community, or I should say a homeowner, can actually rebuild. That's why going back to, if you can look at something in advance, what could we change if we are ever in that situation? That's why it's a lot easier to do when you're not in a recovery situation. Um, you know, one other thing we hear that's really challenging is the idea that, well, if the fire just happened, it's unlikely to happen again, right? And that is not what our models typically say. It's almost, well, if a fire happened here, it means it could happen again. So changing the perceptions of risk can be tricky. Some people are very more aware. They think, oh my God, it's going to happen again. I don't want this to happen. What can I do? But like I said, there are parameters that sometimes people have to work within that restrict their ability to make as much change as we'd like to see.
Yeah, Molly, if people would like to get the benefit of your wisdom without having to add to your calendar, where would you send them?
Well, a little plug on some what I think of as our top resources on our website, communitywildfire.org. You can navigate to something called the Planning Hub, and then there we have national and state WUI planning resources. So we actually created resources if they're available for every state, and there's some national resources too. So if some of your listeners are in Colorado, let's say, if you click on the Colorado button, and you'll see a Marshall Fire Recovery Report from the Urban Land Institute that I was part of on that recovery study. We have a case study on regulating the wildland urban interface in Colorado. I'll point out two other resources that I really like. A few years ago, we worked with the American Planning Association on a publication called Planning the Wildland Urban Interface. That is a free resource. It's a little tricky because it looks like you have to be a member of APA. You don't. You can sign up for a free account. This was paid for in part by the Forest Service. So sign up or go to the Planning the Wildland Urban Interface, and if you want to become a mini wildfire or wildland urban interface planner, that's probably the best report to download. We talk about WUI WUI history, WUI fires, some distinctions between hazard and risk, and some best practices about plans and regulations. So that's a good one too.
I know your crystal ball isn't entirely thorough. It's in terms of what's going to happen to each community going forward, but I really do commend you on having anticipated, because I know you had to start many, many, many years back to anticipate that one day wildfire planning was going to be a big deal, and when it happened, you were going to be ready for it. So huge kudos to you on that foresight.
Thank you. I also got a little lucky in planning school picking this topic, not really knowing it would be such a big topic, but happy I chose the right profession to provide hopefully some guidance and insight towards.
You do an amazing job, and absolutely hit up those websites. I'm going to put a link right here. I'm going to learn how to do that one day. Put a link right here, but I don't know how to do so I just write it in the text anyway. But the point is, follow the link, check out what Molly's working on, because really, really insightful, and not all of it has to have Molly on site to benefit you, because those resources in many cases are based on the fact that fire is physics, and physics apply equally around the world. So Molly, thanks so much for joining me on the Fire Break today.
Thank you, Steve. It was a real pleasure, and thank you for being so patient with waiting to schedule me.
You made it absolutely worth the wait. I appreciate that, Molly. Thanks so much. All right, folks, you've been listening to The Fire Break. The Fire Break is sponsored by Team Wildfire, trying to take the deadly out of wildfire and the property loss reductions as well. I'm going to learn to speak one day. You'll see. One day you'll watch this podcast and you'll say, did that guy have speech lessons or something? Because he's actually stumbling over less words, which is evidence we can make progress, and hopefully we'll make that same kind of progress on wildfires. Thanks for joining me, and we'll see you again soon. Take care.